On 7 September 1940, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft swept across southern England at 25,000 feet, its Zeiss camera clicking methodically through the mission. The pilot banked over Cambridgeshire, photographing what his briefing notes identified as RAF Bassingbourn, a critical bomber training station opened just 2 years earlier. Yet when the prints reached the photo interpretation unit at Zossen, 12 miles southeast of Berlin, the analysts frowned at their stereoscopic viewers. The massive airfield, constructed by John Laing and Son between 1937 and 1939, with 4 C-type hangars and extensive facilities, appeared to be reverting to agriculture. Painted lines mimicking hedgerows snaked across the concrete. Between the runways, rectangular patches displayed the unmistakable texture of growing crops. The site was downgraded in the target folder. Why waste bombs on an airfield that appeared barely operational? This wasn't abandoned farmland. RAF Bassingbourn was one of Britain's busiest training stations, with 54 Wellington bombers and thousands of personnel. What the Germans were observing from 6 miles up was the result of a calculated deception that would become standard practice across Britain, deliberately camouflaging military airfields to resemble the very countryside they displaced. The strips of green between the concrete weren't neglect, they were strategy. And the peculiar genius wasn't just painting fake hedgerows on the runways, it was growing actual crops in the spaces between them. Standard military thinking in 1940 emphasised hardened, obvious airfields. The Luftwaffe's own doctrine called for clearly marked facilities with prominent hangars, wide concrete aprons, and regimented layout. American theorists agreed. Airfields should be functional first, with camouflage as an afterthought. Critics argued that attempting to hide something as massive as an airfield, often covering 400 to 600 acres, was futile. The concrete runways alone left geometric scars visible from 30,000 feet. RAF Sudbury, opened in 1944, had 3 intersecting concrete runways stretching to 1,825 metres, 50 hard stands, and 2 T2 hangars. How could anyone conceal such industrial-scale infrastructure? Yet the British understood something their adversaries initially dismissed. Luftwaffe photo interpreters weren't infallible. They were young men under pressure, analysing hundreds of images daily, searching for specific features. A 1935 Air Ministry report had emphasised that concealment policy needn't make an airfield invisible, it merely had to delay recognition long enough to prevent an accurate attack. In practice, this meant confusing the eye and camera for perhaps 30 seconds as a bomber approached. 30 seconds that might mean the difference between a direct hit and a scattered raid. The camouflage policy, formalised in 1938, rested on a simple agricultural insight. Much of Britain was still patchwork farmland, divided by ancient hedgerows into irregular fields. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance photograph from 1939 showed exactly what analysts expected to see. Small rectangular plots, separated by boundary lines, showing varied tones of cultivation. The fields averaged less than 100 acres. Most farms had fewer than 10 cows, and the landscape was a quilted mosaic of pasture, ploughed earth, and growing crops. An airfield that mimicked this pattern, even crudely, could blend remarkably well from altitude. The technical implementation was more sophisticated than painting lines on grass. At RAF Staverton, opened in 1940, camoufleurs created an imitation lane that snaked diagonally across the tarmac runways. Boundaries mimicking hedgerows were painted directly onto the grass in irregular black lines. Parts of the runways themselves received patterns of irregular dark shapes to simulate woodland patches. At RAF Yeadon, now Leeds Bradford Airport, photographed on the 27th of July 1940, false hedge lines were painted across the runway in an attempt to break up its geometric regularity. But the breakthrough wasn't merely paint, it was biological. When RAF Bassingbourn completed its concrete runway construction in the winter of 1941 to 1942, 3 intersecting strips totalling nearly 11,000 feet, the Air Ministry mandated that the areas between the runways were camouflaged to resemble agricultural crops. Not painted to resemble crops, actual agricultural production. This meant deliberate cultivation. The grass strips between concrete surfaces, often 50 to 150 yards wide, were prepared, seeded and maintained as functional farmland. At some stations, wheat was grown. At others, the emphasis was on hay crops or short grass suitable for grass drying operations. The variation itself enhanced the deception. A Luftwaffe analyst looking at varied crop colours would see the natural irregularity of British agriculture, not the suspiciously uniform green of maintained grass. The practical challenges were substantial. Growing crops on an active military station meant coordinating agricultural schedules with flight operations. Safety regulations specified that grass near runways must be kept to 4 inches maximum. Taller growth created hazards for aircraft forced to make emergency landings on grass. But in the wide spaces between runways, where operational necessity didn't dictate otherwise, crops could grow to natural height. A 1954 parliamentary debate on airfield food production revealed the complexity. Of 176,000 acres of RAF land examined, about 93,000 acres were deemed available for agricultural use. Within that, 41,500 acres allowed unrestricted agriculture, 26,000 acres were suitable for grass farming, and 23,000 acres for grass drying operations. The member for Tunbridge questioned whether corn crops, which grow over 2 feet high, might constitute safety hazards. The Undersecretary confirmed that wheat and barley near runways were prohibited, but acknowledged that in non-operational zones, even tall crops could be cultivated. The war economy made this dual use essential. Britain imported 70% of its food before the war, including 90% of cereals and fats, and German submarine attacks threatened starvation. The government's Plough Up campaign aimed to convert millions of acres of grassland to crops, particularly wheat and potatoes. 1 acre of wheat saved as much shipping space as 7 acres of the best grass in England. Between 1939 and 1941, over 4 million acres were brought under cultivation. Airfield land became part of this national effort. The deception worked because it exploited human pattern recognition. Luftwaffe photo interpreters were trained to identify specific signatures: the geometric regularity of concrete runways, the distinctive shapes of hangars, the circular dispersal patterns of hard stands, the straight lines of perimeter tracks. A reconnaissance photograph of RAF South Cerney from 1940 shows the Luftwaffe's methodology. The Flugplatz airfield is ringed in red, with numbered annotations identifying aircraft parking areas, 4 hangars, accommodation blocks, air traffic control, barracks, and radio masts. Yet the caption notes, the grass takeoff and landing areas, located within the lower circular section within the target area, were camouflaged by painting fake field boundaries. From 25,000 feet, standard reconnaissance altitude, these painted boundaries read as genuine hedgerows. The stereoscopic viewers used by photo interpreters gave 3-dimensional perspective, which helped overcome background camouflage in some cases, but couldn't distinguish painted lines from actual vegetation at extreme altitude. More crucially, the varied crops between runways displayed exactly the tonal variation analysts expected from farmland. A wheat field photographs pale gold, young barley shows darker green, freshly turned earth appears deep brown, pasture grass is mid-tone grey-green. The mixture created the visual complexity of agricultural land. RAF Bassingbourn's camouflage was tested repeatedly. The station was attacked on the 28th of May 1940 by an isolated German raider that dropped 10 bombs. From March to August 1941, as the easternmost bomber operational training unit, it came under fairly regular attack. On 13th August 1941, a German aircraft dropped 4 bombs, one hitting a barrack block and killing 10 personnel. But these were small-scale raids, not the sustained bombardment that major strategic targets received. The Luftwaffe's target folders show why. Bassingbourn was identified, but never prioritised. The camouflage didn't make it invisible, but it did make it appear less operationally significant than it was. RAF Tempsford provides an even more dramatic example. Built at Gibraltar Farm near Sandy, Bedfordshire, the site was initially considered unsuitable for aviation due to frequent fog and waterlogged ground. But British planners recognised these very weaknesses as camouflage assets. German reconnaissance would likely reach the same conclusion about the site's unsuitability. To reinforce this impression, lines were painted across the runways to resemble hedgerows from the air, and hangars were disguised as run-down farm buildings. Tempsford became home to 138 Special Duties Squadron, responsible for parachute operations supporting SOE, SIS, MI9, and resistance groups across occupied Europe. It was one of Britain's most sensitive installations, yet it maintained the appearance of marginal farmland throughout its operational life. The camouflage wasn't perfect, and British authorities knew it. At sites like RAF Coltishall, designated as a fighter station due to its proximity to the coast, the base suffered numerous enemy attacks in the early years of the war. Buildings received camouflage paint, traces of which remain visible today on the officers' mess and barrack blocks, but the geometric regularity of an operational station couldn't be entirely concealed. By 1941, the Luftwaffe Reconnaissance section was in decline, with equipment resources becoming scarce, and bomber crews complained about the print quality of aerial photographs in their target portfolios. Yet even degraded intelligence was sufficient to identify major facilities. What the British achieved wasn't invisibility, it was confusion. A 1940 reconnaissance photograph captured by Belgian resistance forces shows the effectiveness. Analysts could identify that an airfield existed, but determining its operational status, precise layout, and priority required additional sorties and analysis time. That time cost the Luftwaffe opportunities. Intelligence that arrived 3 days late might describe an airfield's disposition that had already changed. Camouflage facilities forced German planners to allocate reconnaissance resources less efficiently, photographing sites that turned out to be decoys or low-priority stations. The agricultural element enhanced this confusion specifically because it was genuine. Decoy airfields, constructed at sites like RAF Wroughton outside Swindon, could simulate the appearance of facilities, but maintaining the illusion required constant attention. Paint faded, canvas structures deteriorated. By contrast, a wheat crop photographed in May 1941 displayed authentic growth patterns. Photographed again in July, it showed the natural progression to harvest colour. This temporal consistency, crops behaving exactly as crops should, reinforced the impression that these were working farms, not military facilities. This wasn't accidental. Commanders weren't clinging to outdated farming practices. They understood that battlefields aren't sterile testing grounds. Luftwaffe photo interpreters were highly trained, but they were analysing thousands of images under time pressure, searching for immediate threats. An airfield that required careful study to confirm, one that didn't immediately present the expected visual signatures, would be bypassed in favour of obvious targets. The camouflage worked not by perfection, but by introducing doubt. The deeper principle was recognition that military infrastructure exists within landscapes, not separate from them. The Luftwaffe expected British airfields to look like German airfields, industrial, purposeful, obviously military. Instead, they encountered facilities that retained the visual character of the countryside they occupied. This wasn't merely aesthetic, it was strategic denial of information. Every hour, a photo interpreter spent confirming that a seemingly agricultural site was actually an active airfield was an hour not spent analysing genuine threats elsewhere. American forces, arriving at these stations from 1942 onwards, were initially sceptical. The 91st Bomb Group, equipped with B-17 flying fortresses, moved into RAF Bassingbourn on the 14th of October 1942. Coming from bases in the United States where airfields were functional and unconcealed, American crews found the British emphasis on camouflage quaint. Yet as operations continued, the wisdom became apparent. German reconnaissance of British bases was constant, and accurate targeting required current intelligence. Facilities that appeared agricultural from altitude, even if their runways were marked in German target folders, received lower priority than obvious military installations. After the war, parliamentary discussions in 1954 revealed the scale of agricultural integration. Of Britain's 176,000 acres of RAF land, over half had been made available for agricultural use during the war. The Undersecretary for Air confirmed that whilst ploughing had been forbidden within airfield perimeters pre-war, modifications to flying instructions reduced the width of grass safety margins around runways, allowing additional land for cultivation. Grass drying operations, which required short young grass exactly as airfields preferred, became the ideal dual-use activity. The crops themselves became economic assets. One member suggested that grass drying, which required expensive machinery and long-term leases, should be facilitated on RAF land to maximise food production whilst maintaining camouflage. The practice continued well into the post-war period. RAF stations designated for care and maintenance often saw their inter-runway spaces planted with crops as both camouflage and economic utilisation. Sites like RAF Mount Farm, after being handed back from American use in May 1945, were kept inactive but maintained agricultural appearance until formal return to farming began in 1949. The airfield was sold for farming in 1957, and part was bought for gravel extraction in 1961. The transition from military facility to genuine farmland was seamless, precisely because the visual deception had always incorporated actual agriculture. Military theorists who dismissed airfield camouflage as futile made several errors. First, they assumed perfect intelligence. In reality, even the meticulous Luftwaffe reconnaissance program, which photographed every part of the United Kingdom from Orkney to Cornwall between 1935 and 1941, couldn't maintain current intelligence on every facility. Priorities had to be set. Camouflage influenced those priorities. Second, critics evaluated camouflage as a binary, either perfect concealment or useless effort. But operational deception operates in gradations. An airfield that appears 60% as threatening as it actually is receives proportionally less attention. Resources allocated elsewhere create gaps in coverage. Those gaps become operational opportunities. Third, they underestimated the cognitive burden on photo interpreters. By 1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance units were stretched thin, print quality had deteriorated, and bomber crews complained about the intelligence they received. In this environment, camouflage that created analysis delays or required confirmation sorties had disproportionate impact. The de Havilland aircraft factory at Hatfield demonstrated this principle. Illusionists removed part of the roof and deployed smoke canisters. A German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the site, and interpreters downgraded it from an important economic target to one already suffering severe bomb damage. The deception wasn't perfect. It wouldn't withstand ground-level inspection, but it worked from altitude under operational conditions. For RAF personnel stationed at these camouflage facilities, the agricultural elements were simply part of base life. At Royal Air Force Bassingbourn, ground crews serviced Wellington bombers between wheat fields. At Tempsford, agents preparing for clandestine drops into occupied France walked past hangars painted to resemble farm buildings. The juxtaposition of military intensity and rural normalcy was jarring to newcomers but quickly normalised. American personnel, particularly those arriving in 1943 to 1944 for D-Day preparations, found the contrast striking. One B-17 pilot stationed at a camouflaged East Anglian base wrote of the surreal experience: concrete runways painted with fake hedgerows, operational dispersals positioned beside genuine crop fields, and the constant background hum of agricultural machinery mixed with aircraft engines. The Lancaster bombers that dominated British strategic bombing, requiring longer runways than earlier types, operated from facilities that from altitude still appeared to be patchwork farmland. The grass strips themselves required constant maintenance by airfield construction squadrons. At RAF Elgin in Scotland, opened in June 1940 as a satellite for RAF Lossiemouth, drainage problems from heavy flying operations necessitated installation of a full bar and rod system in 1944. The balance between operational requirements and agricultural appearance was continuous work, yet this very maintenance, keeping grass cut, ensuring drainage, rotating which areas bore heavy traffic, reinforced the agricultural impression when photographed. Active farms show signs of cultivation and care, so did these camouflaged airfields. What made this work wasn't any single feature, it was the systematic integration of deception into airfield design from 1938 onwards. Paint alone could be identified, crops alone could be ploughed for runways, but paint and crops together, combined with irregular layout, dispersed facilities, camouflaged buildings, and the natural tendency of British landscape to subdivide into small irregular fields, this created visual complexity that even skilled photo interpreters struggled to pass quickly. The Luftwaffe expected airfields to announce themselves. The RAF built airfields that whispered. This wasn't technological sophistication. The materials were paint, crops, and canvas. It was conceptual sophistication, understanding that concealment isn't about invisibility, but about controlling what the enemy sees and when they see it. Consider the arithmetic. If camouflage delayed recognition of RAF Bassingbourn by even 3 reconnaissance missions, requiring the Luftwaffe to photograph it in May, again in June for confirmation, and a third time in July to establish current status, that consumed resources. a Dornier Do 17P reconnaissance aircraft flying from occupied France to Cambridgeshire and back represented fuel, air crew hours, and analysis time. Multiply that across dozens of camouflage stations, and the cumulative intelligence burden became substantial. More crucially, delayed or uncertain intelligence meant bombing raids were planned against outdated information. A station photographed in April might show different dispersal patterns, different aircraft numbers, or different operational status by June. Attackers arriving based on April intelligence would find their briefing folders didn't match reality. This wasn't abstract theory. RAF personnel at Bassingbourn, RAF Elgin, and dozens of other stations lived through raids that were inaccurate, poorly timed, or inexplicably light relative to the site's importance. The camouflage didn't stop attacks, but it degraded their effectiveness. By 1943, when Allied air superiority over Europe was established, many camouflage precautions were relaxed. The need for deception diminished as Luftwaffe reconnaissance capacity collapsed, yet the infrastructure remained. Post-war aerial photographs of British airfields show the ghostly outlines, painted hedgerows fading on concrete, inter-runway strips reverting to genuine agricultural use, the strange hybrid landscape where military necessity had briefly coexisted with rural disguise. The Luftwaffe's own records, declassified in 1974, reveal the success. Target folders show British airfields identified but misassessed. Photo interpretation notes record uncertainty about operational status. Intelligence summaries prioritise obvious targets over camouflage facilities. The de Havilland factory downgraded due to simulated damage. RAF Tempsford appearing as marginal farmland whilst hosting Britain's most secret aviation operations. RAF Bassingbourn photographed repeatedly yet never receiving the concentrated bombardment its strategic importance warranted. Modern analysts, studying these 1940s reconnaissance photographs with digital tools and unlimited time, can identify the deceptions easily. The painted hedgerows don't quite align with surrounding field patterns. The inter-runway crops show slightly too much uniformity in some images. But Luftwaffe interpreters in 1940 to 1943 didn't have digital analysis or unlimited time. They had stereoscopic viewers, pressure to produce intelligence quickly, and thousands of potential targets across Britain. In that environment, an airfield that looked partly like farmland, that showed crops between its runways, that displayed the visual complexity of rural England rather than the geometric clarity of military infrastructure, such a facility introduced doubt. And doubt, in intelligence work, is delay. Delay is resource misallocation. Resource misallocation is strategic advantage. The RAF didn't grow crops on their airfields despite military necessity. They grew crops because of it. Every acre of wheat between concrete runways was simultaneously food production, camouflage, and deception. Every Luftwaffe analyst who looked at those reconnaissance photographs and saw farmland was seeing exactly what British camoufleurs intended. A landscape that didn't scream "bomb me," that required confirmation, that seemed less urgent than other targets. This wasn't clinging to agricultural tradition. This was weaponizing the very landscape that Britain had cultivated for centuries. The hedgerows that had divided English fields since medieval times became painted deceptions on runways. The crops that had fed the nation became visual camouflage protecting its military infrastructure. The pastoral countryside that seemed so antithetical to modern warfare became its most effective concealment. German reconnaissance pilots, photographing Britain from 25,000 feet, saw patchwork farmland below. They were right. They were also wrong. That field of wheat might be surrounding an active bomber station. That pasture might be concealing hard stands with 50 aircraft. That rural landscape, so peaceful from altitude, might be the very facility their intelligence officers desperately needed to locate. The crops grew, the aircraft flew, and the Luftwaffe, for crucial months in 1940 and 1941, couldn't always tell the difference. That was the point.